Today's discussion will be presented in 3 sections since we are recording it for a radio broadcast on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. You're welcome to post questions and comments during the session, and we'll try to answer them online. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Tom Temin, host and managing editor of the Federal Drive on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.
Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are Leo Scanlon, Senior Advisor for Healthcare and Public Health Sector Cybersecurity in the CIO Office of Health and Human Services, Dr. Ray Latier, Chief of the Cybersecurity Division at the United States Marine Corps, and Tony Hubbard, a Principal at KPMG. And it's good to have you all here, and we've really got a lot of ground to cover because cybersecurity is really everybody's business, and now we are in the post-WannaCry era, which seemed to add the whole idea of ransomware to everything else we've been worrying about, insider threats and so forth. So I think a good way to begin would be to, since we have a really major civilian side agency and a really big military side agency, maybe just describe, first of all, the status of your continuous monitoring and continuous diagnostics and mitigation programs, which are ultimately designed to catch all this stuff, and give us how it looks right now and maybe what some of your plans are for the next 18 months or so. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Latier?
Okay, great. Last time I was even here with you, before I talked about a particular program we have that's aligned with the Department of Defense's Comply to Connect. We've actually been making progress on that now. We had the contract let, and we're going to be doing some testing in the National Capital Region. What this is that there's a particular network access control device that is at every base, will be at every base. And then when a system plugs into the Ethernet port, that network access device will isolate it, put it into a virtual private network, scan it, find a problem, patch, remediate it, and then allow it only then to connect to the rest of the network.
So even if it connected yesterday?
Even if it connected yesterday. In fact, once it's connected on, every hour it's pulsed and made sure that if there's a new patch has to come out, a new security technical implementation guide standard had to be implemented, it would get done automatically. The beautiful thing about this, that I'm such a passionate person for, is that it reduces the amount of mindless labor that humans have to do. Instead of having some more, Marine or civilian run around with a disk all the time, or try to run and do scans with the laptops on their own, this actually does it for them. And now we only take a look at the anomalies. What isn't being done? What hasn't been reached out? What hasn't connected to the network in a while? That means that the person can go actually do human analysis and really get into deep, hard problems and maybe get a better quality of work with them. It also means if I don't need 12 people doing it, I only need 4, I can repurpose the others to do other things, give them other opportunities to work with it, and there's a lot to do in the cybersecurity field. It's been taking a while to get together. I mean, you and I were talking about before, and you wisely asked me a couple times, okay, you've told me about it, when is it going to happen? And I've been pushing, and I'm proud to say we've actually got the contract let. Marine Corps Systems Command is working on some of the design aspects of it. The vendors are brought in. In fact, we're going to be having a meeting on it next week to look at the standards of how it's going to be implemented for this test, and how we can move off from what we've learned when we did it a few years back at Marine Corps Camp Lejeune.
So it sounds like the idea is it orchestrates a lot of steps that used to be done serially or by people or by different machines.
Exactly, and then you can take and expose that up as you look for continuous monitoring. Now you can expose the data up down to the system level. I can identify it by machine address code, IP address, and say, what's the status of that box at this time? And that now I can provide over to Marine Corps Cyber Command, and they in turn can expose that to Cyber Command. I can expose it to the DoD CIO. We can share with other services and organizations. So it gives us a transparency. So if something like WannaCry happens again, we'd be able to say, well, we were able to push that patch that Microsoft gave us back in March, and look, we can validate it's been done, and such. It lowers the worry of leadership. And at the same time, if we do have some anomalies out there, we'll catch them and we'll be able to remediate them. So it's exciting.
Does it work with mobile device, or do you plan for mobile devices to be part of this pulsing? And
that's a good point, because we're just now implementing a wireless instantiation across the entire Marine Corps. We've been kind of reluctant for that because of some areas where we are, where the frequencies, you have to work with certain national agencies, foreign countries with their control of the frequency and the spectrum. But we're actually moving out on that to do exactly that part of how can I take and work with your phone. We've got to be very careful, because anytime I take your phone as an individual, you want to connect and use our wireless, I got to make sure I don't hurt you. But with government furnished devices, absolutely, that's going to be part of the approach is how can I take and make sure that that one's maintained. We do it already with some of our BlackBerry devices, and as we move to other devices of Androids and iPhones that'll come down the path, we'll be doing it the same way.
Okay, interesting. And Leo, at HHS, I guess you're sort of a giant agency and a lot of small agencies. CMS, what does the CDM program look like, CM program look like there, and what are some of the plans?
I'll tell you, the small agencies are not that small. It's a very large federated organization.
Well, they're not shoe stores.
No, that's for sure. And as you can imagine, the challenge of implementing a program like CDM program or continuous authorization, risk management framework, all of which are part of a package across a federated organization as large as HHS is very big. A couple of things that we've done and successes that we've had I think are very important. The most important success we've had was responding to the cyber sprint effort to get rid of passwords and to go for two-factor authentication across our access control environment. We've achieved essentially 100% on our immediate networks. We're moving to drive that into the system level and the admin level, and this is probably the most important single defense that you can do these days, and we've prioritized that and had great success with it. Following on, though, from the continuous standpoint, is that the cybersecurity is built into the work plan and the strategic work plan of the CIOs across the agencies. They have embraced it and built it into their individual operating divisions, and it is being done in the framework of the cybersecurity framework, the NIST cybersecurity framework, to provide continuous assessment of the maturity of these programs. And then the final bit is the continuous diagnostics and mitigation effort that's coming out of DHS. This is providing a standardized way for us to do the things that Ray was just describing, to put in basic tools that will give us the core data that we need to understand what's on our network, what state is it in, and has it fallen out of nominal conditions on a continuous basis. This is allowing us to move away from the old model of compliance, cyclical reauthorization, and to give the CIOs and the CIO and the top leadership of the agency a continuous picture of the risk state that the agency is facing. At the same time, we have another challenge, and that is that we interact with the sector, with the healthcare sector, which is the sector of the economy that is under the most heavy attack right now of any area, any sector of the economy. The attacks and successful attacks directed at the healthcare sector increased over 1,000% in last year alone. And at the same time, it is probably the most immature part of the economy in terms of embracing or understanding the challenges of cybersecurity for many different reasons. So we have a massive challenge that HHS is trying to step up to support of assisting the sector in understanding how to use things like the cybersecurity framework, NIST guidance, other guidance that would build maturity into organizations that don't have the resources that we do in the government, that the military does, or that major corporations do, and 98% of the healthcare sector is unresourced. So these are the two challenges that we're facing at HHS. They're very closely intertwined, and the Office of the CIO is making it our business to provide the knowledge and experience that we have gained over years of working this problem and making that available to the rest of the sector and assisting in pulling this out and building up the resilience of the sector as a whole.
And for HHS, it's probably true that the problem with the healthcare sector, all the providers and networks out there, is not just an academic problem for HHS. You're connected with them. You're sending payments and information and data back and forth on a variety of fronts, so that their bloodlines are really ultimately mixed in with the government's.
We are, as I mentioned a little earlier, CMS is processing over $1 million a minute in Medicare and Medicaid payments, affecting over 50 million Americans. We are holding the life data of those citizens. We are holding everything down to some of their genomic data, and it's in the custody of HHS. We are interacting with medical device manufacturers. FDA is every day working with the device manufacturers to assist with, driving security into the devices themselves. So we're closely monitoring. We have a unique view of the sector and its pulse, a finger on its pulse, that we're trying to, as best we can, turn this into understanding, guidance, and risk assessment, both so that the White House, the Congress, and our oversight organizations can understand where the sector is, and so that we can work with the sector organizations, the large trade associations, the hospital groups, to find out where their real pain points are, help them identify their worst problem first, and then look for ways to leverage resources that move solutions into the stream.
Okay, good. And Tony, you have a government-wide view from the consulting practice there in cyber at KPMG. Tell us what it looks like agencies are doing from that macro level.
Right. Well, I think to follow on to what Ray and Leo talked about, one of the key themes that through that entire discussion was the theme of good fundamentals and good hygiene around cybersecurity activities, just blocking and tackling fundamentals. And so we talked about password management being a key theme. We talked about monitoring, auditing being a key theme, third-party management being a key theme. And these are elements that I think many times folks get lost in when you hear about ransomware attacks and WannaCry, and they think, oh, it's a technical issue. It really isn't so much a technical issue. I think Leo hit it right on. I mean, having dual-factor authentication is instrumental to help prevent those types of attacks. It's having good fundamentals around your patching of your devices, making sure you have an inventory of where your high-value assets are, and making sure you have your networks and environment segmented to protect those assets. And I think those are fundamental elements that oftentimes get lost when you think about all the tremendous technologies that are out there, and that's fantastic, but you get a little lost sometimes in that the technology is not the silver bullet. You know, you got to have those basic fundamentals in place before I think you can move down a lot of these paths.
And Tony, if you would, let's talk a little bit about automating the risk management framework itself, because a lot of agencies complain about what a manual and labor-intensive task that is.
Sure. So the risk management framework is certainly a very important process as part of the agency's continuous monitoring efforts. But you're right, the challenge is it is very manual oriented. There's a lot of documentation involved. There's a lot of emails back and forth, email approvals and things like that. So it's important to have a workflow, an automated workflow or an automated engine to help facilitate that process. So it can kind of help the security documentation as it's prepared to be in an automated way move through one stage to the next stage. There's a 6-stage process in the RMF, so having that process automated as much as you possibly can is very important.
And can the same process engine be used across government, or does it need to be tailored for each agency, or is this pretty much a standard type of exercise?
No, it's actually, that's a good thing. It can be tailored. We're in the process of tailoring it now for several potential federal clients. So we can tailor it to the particular agency, and there's certainly a framework that fits with the RMF process, but obviously each agency or department has its own unique process that they want to move through, a different approval cycle and things like that. So the workflow engine can certainly be tailored in that way.
And what are you seeing in terms of the threat vectors and the threat environment? Because we hear a lot that is never static.
Sure.
If it was, we'd have an easy job here. So what has changed? What does WannaCry and events like that represent in terms of how the threat environment as a whole is changing?
Oh, it's certainly changing, very dynamic. Certainly Leo and Ray are right in the middle of this in their roles. But whether it's WannaCry or just this week, there was a new vulnerability announced through some cloud providers that had some issues around some classified data getting out there. And so the threat vector is constantly changing. And I think it's very hard to keep up, obviously. And it goes back to a lot of the fundamentals we're talking about, specifically around cloud platforms, is making sure you've got a good inventory of the data that you're sharing with your cloud providers, so that I think sometimes there's a perception that if we're outsourcing an application or a system or an element of our environment to a third-party provider, that it's their responsibility, when in fact that's not the case. It's still our responsibility to manage that, and I think that's certainly a key theme that I think will continue to bubble up. When you look at a lot of these attacks that have happened recently, OPM, Target, these were third-party provider types of issues. So as more and more of our federal critical infrastructure entities and federal agencies deploy more reliance on third parties, that's going to even become more significant. You know, one of the initiatives out recently is NIST has issued 800-171, which is a requirement for contractors to make sure they have the appropriate security controls in place, and that's going to be hopefully very positive and instrumental in making sure that a lot of the third-party providers have those controls in place.
I do hear a lot more agency people these days citing the NIST publications, still the basic one, 800-53, but also 171 and a few others. It seems like they're almost a little later to the party in accepting the value of the 1,500 controls that NIST outlines almost than private industry was. It seems like, you know, they were like unheralded in their own country, so to speak, to use a metaphor, but now that seems to be changing a lot.
But yeah, there was issues that you had various government organizations that wanted to have their own standard, and sometimes it did not align well with what NIST was doing. But the strength of what NIST had and what Dr. Ross had done on this is to put some science rigor behind it. I'm glad to say now that most of us in the government now really align to that well. But the Marine Corps, we don't follow NIST 853. We actually did CNSS 1253 because we have some Intel systems as well. So we raised the watermark a little higher. Now some of our business system people are a little uncomfortable because they've got to do a little bit more work. They have some more controls to watch for. But that kind of brings us up that everybody's at a persistent level. But it goes back to a common federal standard that we all have to follow.
And how does the threat environment look to the government people? Leo?
Well, and I wanted to follow on your question there because it's an interesting thing about the history of how the NIST documentation came about. I'm a major partisan of that from day one. And Ron Ross will be the first to tell you that if they could have done it by publishing the risk management framework first and the control series second, they would have done that. The control series kind of kept people in a compliance mode, sort of a checklist mode that was the old way, the familiar way of doing things. And it took a little while until the risk management framework documents got percolated through the government. But I think we've turned the corner. I think you're right that fundamentally at the federal level we're moving in this direction of risk management. So it's appropriate because the threat vector that we're talking about has become, WannaCry, a very good example, the single largest global cybersecurity attack to date, with a velocity that has never been seen before. And this is the real challenge because risk management is about response, it's about resilience. What we see with WannaCry, and for those of us who've known this for some time, there is no way you are immune to these things. You are going to be attacked, and it's going to be successful. The real challenge is resilience and response, and this is where the risk management framework is taking us. We have technical challenges in the healthcare sector. Ray and I were talking earlier, very interesting parallel to the battlefield. We have to be careful that our security technologies do not inhibit the ability of the responder to deal with the heart attack or the soldier to activate the weapon. These are life and death matters, and so we have a lot of technical research to do to bring our security technologies up to the challenges that are now in the forefront of these attacks. People believed for many years that there was no particular vulnerability to, say, a pacemaker, and that's a good movie story, but who's going to do it? It's a lot easier to just assassinate somebody, let's get real. Well, WannaCry was not out to assassinate anybody, but it attacked medical devices all around the world, just because it did. So now we see, and I think this is the big wake-up call for all of us, that IT devices are vulnerable. Security has to be across the board, and it has to be continuous. So this is where the challenges are lying in the future.
And if I may just kind of add on a little bit more of tying into the Internet of Things and the healthcare devices and such, what the approach for the risk management framework gave us is the ability to start to shape and modify and adjust the controls. Rather than having the checklist construct that you had to follow all of these, and then of course deforest Brazil to document something that is very simple, you actually were able to say, well, this particular device only has 3 security controls. That's all I need to focus on, and allows us now to monitor against that, because we had a lot of people who are trying to say, how do I do this? How do I do the evaluation? How do I meet the standard of compliance? And in many cases they would either try to change the name. Oh, this is not really a computer system, this is a weather system or something. So they would ignore it entirely, or they would do all the extra paperwork, cost so much more money, and it needed to, when in fact they could tailor controls, identify it, have the analysis, be able to justify it, and then say, that's all I need to protect. I'm excited about what we're doing in the Internet of Things, particularly in healthcare and aspects and ICS and SCADA, is that if we know what those control aspects are, we can actually get to them at the boundary on the network itself. Maybe now start to slow it down. We're never going to stop it right, but at least if we can start slowing it down, get alarms, start to see it, impact that kill chain a little bit, I think we're going to be a little bit better in the long run.
So really the criterion is if it has an IP address, then it comes under the umbrella of all of this.
Seriously, if it's hardware, software, with an operating system, firmware, and then an application on it, that's where it goes into. And if we read what the current executive order came out, we saw signed up by the president, change the definition of IT. Because if we take a look at what was back in Title 40 and Title 44, IT is a very specific office automation construct. But what was added on this executive order was the operational technology determinations. It's also these capabilities that will do a physical function, our capability, which ties into what we're doing for, for water control systems and heating systems and such. So I think what they're trying to do is get us to focus on it all. That's got a lot of people panicking because for many years, as I said, they tried to ignore it. They said, I call it something else, and now they're being pulled in that they have to identify it, and they needed to.
All right, well, that's a good place to stop for a break right now while people are panicking. My guests today are Leo Scanlon, Senior Advisor for Healthcare and Public Health Sector Cybersecurity in the CIO Office at Health and Human Services, Dr. Ray Latier, Chief of the Cybersecurity Division at the Marine Corps, and Tony Hubbard, a Principal at KPMG. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. This discussion is entitled The Intersection of Cybersecurity and Intelligent Automation, sponsored by KPMG, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.